This episode profiles the historical connection between 18th Street and the Mexican Mafia. The historical relationship between the Mexican Mafia and Sureño urban street terrorists can be graphically highlighted throughout the Southern California landscape in virtually every Mexican gang neighborhood. Between 1985 and 1995, in Los Angeles alone, there were 154 homicides linked to the 18th Street Gang in what was called the Decade of Death. Like every Mexican street gang in the Southland, 18th Street is comprised of various cliques or subsets that correspond with groups of similar age members who grow up together. The detailed history of 18th Street's formation will be covered at another time in another episode on another channel. Formed in 1966 in the Rampart district of West Los Angeles, Barrio 18th Street entered the street gang picture and would become a formidable force in the gangster world. Boasting a made M. Carnal enhances the status of a Mexican street gang. By the conclusion of the 1970s, all major Mexican gangs in Los Angeles and most of Southern California were represented by full-fledged Mexican Mafia members. Manuel Tristan was also known as Smiley from 18th Street and was the first representative from its ranks. Made in the mid-1970s and somewhat obscure, Smiley was later followed by several more prominent members, three in particular who would forever impact the connection between 18th Street and the Mexican Mafia. According to the Los Angeles Almanac, in the year 1995, there were 807 gang-related homicides in the county of Los Angeles. During this time period, MacArthur Park was being disputed by several Sureño gangs, including MS-13 and 18th Street. The park and surrounding area was and still is, to some extent, a shopping mall for illicit activity where one can purchase drugs, fraudulent documents, such as green cards, driver's licenses, and social security cards, counterfeit merchandise, and prostitution. The three most historical and significant OGs from 18th Street in connection with the Mexican Mafia were VESI, Night Owl, and Puppet. They were from a time period I refer to as the MS Pepsi generation. In the 1980s, VESI Sagato, aka VESI, was extremely active as a member of the 18th Street Tiny Winos clique. VESI was the first Samoan to be recruited into La M and was a well-known street intimidator. When the Columbia Little Cycles clique was formed in 1985, they became VESI's primary group of 18th Streeters he worked with for conducting street business. During this time period, Ruben Castro, also known as Night Owl from the 18th Street Shadow Park Locals, was operating on the outside. Night Owl was a hope-to-die tecato, a heroin user, who was loved by his 18th Street homies and looked up to as a neighborhood OG. Francisco Martinez, also known as Puppet from the 18th Street Pico Gangsters, was next in line and he paroled from prison sometime in the 1980s. Joining fellow 18th Street M. Carnales, VESI, and Night Owl, Puppet discovered his Pico Gangsters clique had disbanded, so he hooked up with VESI and the Columbia Little Cycles for the negocios at hand, the business. Prior to the Mexican Mafia's plan to absorb LA gangsters into their program, 18th Street already had lucrative criminal activities taking place in their territories. They were engaged in drug sales, the taxing of small merchants, generating counterfeit IDs and passports, extortion, and other endeavors. VESI, Night Owl, and Puppet were vital factors in controlling the largest Sureño street gang in the United States. In the early 1990s, the EME introduced a no drive-by edict, which prohibited street gangs from engaging in drive-bys and encouraged walk-ups. Identify, isolate, and confront your target by walking up and blasting at point-blank range. Puppet and Night Owl believed the MA's no drive-by edict was doomed for failure, and a subtle attempt to sabotage this effort was put into motion with drive-by campaigns conducted by 18th Street against some of their street adversaries. With the overwhelming majority of Southern California street gangs embracing the Mexican Mafia's no drive-by edict, those who defied this mandate were green-lighted, targeted for assaults and/or execution. 18th Street gang members soon discovered that Puppet and Night Owl's MS status was insufficient to spare 18th Street from drive-by violations, as they were brutally targeted on the streets, in the county jail, and in state prisons. Inevitably, they agreed to the MA program and their resistance ended. During this time period in 18th Street's history, Puppet Martinez began to experience internal problems with the Mexican Mafia, and Night Owl Castro emerged as the prime catalyst for the offending cliques. Thanks to Night Owl, the Columbia Little Cycles clique has been continuously loyal to the MA program since its inception. In a very short period of time, approximately 3 months, he succeeded in reining in the 54th Street Locos and South Central, bringing them into compliance by paying a multiple $1,000 fine, thereby removing the green light and re-establish them as functioning Surenos. Night Owl also succeeded in rehabilitating Puppet with his MA confederates. In 1992, VESI was returned to state prison, where he became embroiled in Mexican Mafia internal politics. When he paroled, several attempts were made on his life by fellow 18th Street members, a continuation of the green light placed upon him by the fellas. VESI would ultimately die of natural causes. In 1994, Puppet Martinez was arrested for being in possession of a bulletproof vest and for illegal re-entry, and was sent to federal prison. Puppet is a Mexican national with family in Mexico who owned property on Puppet's behalf. In 1995, the MS suffered its first of several RICO federal racketeering indictments. Many Mexican Mafia members and associates were convicted of charges ranging from extortion, drug conspiracies, murders, and several other charges. Night Owl was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The Mexican Mafia has capitalized on street gangs like 18th Street by tapping into a seemingly endless reservoir of gang soldiers. Like a destructive and voracious tsunami, much of our historical gang activity can be traced to California, with an exclamation point punctuating the city that made gang life fashionable, Los Angeles. From lowrider cars to baggy attire to organized influence and domination of street life, the exportation of the LA street mentality is evidenced throughout the U.S. Pick your California flavor. Street gangs, Crips, Bloods, Sureños, Norteños, MS-13, 18th Street. Prison gangs. The axis of evil includes the Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Nuestra Familia, Black Guerrilla Family. Amazingly, even the Texas Syndicate was founded in the California prison system. OMGs, outlaw motorcycle gangs, Hells Angels, Mongols, and Vagos. The list goes on with every imaginable ethnic group represented and originating from the state of California. Combine this with California being the most liberal state in the Union, and it shares a border with Mexico for a non-stop flow of illegal drugs. Now we stir in these ingredients and you have the recipe for disaster. So we know that the Mexican Mafia is forever in search of gangs, gangsters, and criminal entrepreneurs who can earn money for the fellas. Generating revenue requires muscle and loyal enforcers. Cultivating loyal enforcers, especially men who place the ME before their own homeboys, was a surefire way of demonstrating you were for real. The ability versus the willingness to pull a trigger. There is a big difference when you search for loyal, aggressive, and willing street enforcers. Seeking out those who are willing to do so at the drop of a hat is what the Emmett desires most. Among several eager 18th Street shooters, two of the main enforcers for Night Owl and Puppet are shown here. Anthony Zaragoza, also known as Coco, and Juan Romero, aka Termite, performed several street executions for La M on the streets of LA from the 1990s through the early 2000s. Automatic weapons were a dime a dozen during this period. They displayed their loyalty by specializing in taking out fellow 18th Street gang members who were not in compliance with the Mexican Mafia program. In the end, Coco and Termite would take two separate roads on their way to Emmett glory. Coco received a life sentence in the feds, was recruited into the Mexican Mafia, whereas Termite would run into trouble with the fellas, lock up, and he turned state's evidence. He testified against Coco and Puppet, who was also convicted in this case along with 24 members of the infamous 18th Street Little Cycles. In an intercepted communication from Coco to Puppet, Coco referred to his Mexican Mafia boss as Dad. As mentioned earlier, Puppet Martinez was already in federal custody when the indictments were handed down. He was charged and convicted of operating a racketeering enterprise from his prison cell and relying on his wife Janie Garcia as his trusted surrogate and field commander. This was not uncommon with the fellas, as many of them employed the services of their women. After all, who better to trust as your financial advisor and facilitator? The 18th Street gang members affectionately referred to Puppet and Janie as Dad and Mom. Janie, who is shown in this photo with Puppet, was nicknamed the Lady Boss or Black Widow by Surenos and 18th Street gang members. On February 4, 2003, Francisco Puppet Martinez was sentenced to life in prison plus 60 years after being convicted for running the Columbia Little Cycles in a criminal enterprise. Puppet has been housed at the ADX Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado since his conviction. He is one of over a dozen Mexican Mafia members housed at this federal prison, and there are over 20 made members with life sentences throughout the Federal Bureau of Prisons. On December 8, 2008, 9 leaders of the 18th Street Gang were named in a suit filed by Los Angeles City Attorney Rock Delgadillo, demanding civil damages on behalf of residents of 2 LA neighborhoods. Taking a page out of the DEA and federal government, this lawsuit against gang leaders was the first of its kind for the city of Los Angeles. Ruben Night Owl Castro and Frank Puppet Martinez were named along with Araceli Traviesa Bravo, Michael Mousy Pineda, Jose Wicked Alvarez, Noah Little Duster Chavez, Efrain Dandy Boy Torres, Jose Toro Perez, and Sergio Tricky Pantoja. Some of the higher-placed 18th Street crew leaders working under Puppet and Night Owl were referred to by LAPD gang officers as the $1 Million Club. One of the gangsters owned a Godfather-like compound equipped with surveillance cameras and electronic gadgets. From some of the traceable monies, Puppet was accused of generating approximately $40,000 a month from his Supermax cell, and authorities confiscated a stash of over $440,000 from one of Puppet's relatives, which was connected with 18th Street Gang criminal endeavors. On January 15, 2009, under the 2008 Amendment for Criminal Asset Seizures, the City of LA won a $5 million civil judgment against 18th Street. These guys don't employ bookkeepers, but their collective revenues cannot be measured. I can only tell you that the average prison inmate, dozens of them serving life sentences, do not generate this kind of revenue from a prison cell. Like Puppet, Ruben Naidao Castro successfully oversees his street operations by the use of family and legal facilitators. Naidao controlled the Shadow Park locals and the Hoover locals from his maximum security ADX prison cell. Already serving multiple life sentences, he received an additional 27 years and 3 months on November 18, 2009 for racketeering. Such overkill, you would think, would be an exercise in futility for the government. Once you have someone of this caliber secure, with say 2 life sentences, or the equivalent thereof, bringing them out from a high security confinement to become defendants or witnesses in criminal trials only succeeds in giving them a free bus ride. Outside court cases increases the ability for prison gang members to communicate easier with others to further their criminal business. They gain access to attorneys who are used for transmitting messages, instructions, and other communications. It also heightens the prospect of an escape attempt with multiple avenues of possibilities to consider. Some members will intentionally pick up a new case for the purpose of initiating a series of court dates from which they can extend their operations and increase their chances of a long-shot development that could work in their favor. To pick up a new case, a new beef, means committing a felony offense, such as an assault or murder that could warrant extended prosecution. Well into the 21st century, other active Mexican Mafia members from 18th Street include Jorge Gonzalez, also known as Caballo, who is in the California State Prison System, and Anthony Zaragoza, aka Coco, doing life in the feds. There were 2 18th Street gang associates, Francisco Escalante, known as Sleeper, and his cousin Ramon Tannery, aka Thumper, who were rumored to be made and confirmed to be working as Mexican Mafia muscle in Tijuana, Mexico, with OG member Robert Reese, also known as Peanut Butter. Mexican Mafia fugitives have always enjoyed the safe haven of eluding American justice by heading south of the border and enjoying the sheer bliss of mixing heroin business with pleasure. Drugs, women, money, and kicking back on the Baja Beach is a page out of a Mexican gangster's fantasy playbook. Operating in Mexico can be potentially volatile and not recommended for those with a heart condition. Not only are you rubbing elbows with cartel figures, you have wannabe cartel guys, rip-off artists operating without regard to any organization, corrupt cops, and Mexican Mafia politics all steered into one pot of about 1.5 million inhabitants. When a Mexican Mafia member disappears from the law enforcement radar, many are later discovered to have merely traveled across the southern border where new friends welcomed them with open arms. Sleeper and Thumper were part of an EME team that included Efrain Diaz, known as Diablo from Artesia, and Nelson Flores, also known as Mula from MS-13. Besides Peanut Butter and those mentioned in his Tijuana crew, Daryl D. Castrejon is another Mexican Mafia member, a fugitive, believed to be operating from a Mexican hideout. Running from United States justice, avoiding the intense FBI and law enforcement detection back home, and operating where law enforcement either doesn't know you or can oftentimes be friendly to criminals, are major pluses for the fellas. Living in Mexico allows for solidifying ties with various Mexican drug trafficking organizations. It allows La M the luxury of comfortably expanding their presence by conducting transnational criminal activity working with Mexican Mafia associates. M members and highly placed Surenos can effectively supervise Sureño crews operating on their behalf in the U.S. and in Mexico. From their Mexican base, they are still able to conduct conference calls with Mexican Mafia members in U.S. prisons and on the streets. On June 4, 2016, Robert Peanut Butter Ruiz died of liver cancer in Tijuana, where his passing was observed by M. Carnales and highly placed Surenos. Peanut Butter had been a conduit for many imprisoned M members in the California Security Housing Units, also known as the SHUs, who were utilizing attorney Gabriel Sendejas Chavez to facilitate messages from Mexican Mafia members inside Pelican Bay, state and federal prisons, and Carnales in Mexico. In the aftermath of his death, M members jockeyed for position and control of the Sureños based on the streets and prisons of Tijuana and Baja California. One of these ambitious members was Jose Bat Marquez, an M member serving a federal life sentence, who has had his hand in many street gang drug operations throughout the country. Hand-carried messages were sent to 18 streeters, Sleeper and Thumper, with orders to clean house and kill off several individuals in Tijuana on behalf of La M. Every street gang connected to the Mexican Mafia has a unique story, and 18th Street continues to produce Sureños at an alarming rate. The destiny of the hardcore 18th Street gangsters follows the typical storyline: life in prison, fatal gunshot victims, heroin-related deaths, and some have turned state's evidence to save themselves from the premature departure from this world. Sleeper and Thumper were recently confirmed dead in Tijuana, Baja California, Mexico. Francisco Sleeper Escalante died of a heroin overdose, and his cousin, Ramon Thumper Tannery, was shot to death by unknown assailants. There is no confirmed reason for Thumper's shooting, but in the end, all roads in the MA underworld seem to lead to those similar, inevitable conclusions. My hope and prayer is that the Lord's Spirit will touch 18th Street and shine a mighty light into the abyss. May He open the eyes of the young and old who look up to the OGs and La M. May He reveal Himself to the misguided men and women who navigate down the road to destruction on that truck with no brakes. Thank you in advance for those you pluck away and save from their utter doom. In Jesus' name, amen.